Phil.
We're going to be in Acts chapter 20, the very first part of it. And there's one basic thing that I'd like for us to kind of cover today. And that is, we're reading a passage where there's not a whole lot happening. Yes, Eutychus is going to fall out of the window. But oftentimes during what are sometimes either the kind of the quiet or the unassuming times in a person's life, God may be doing something that is always not evident on the surface. You've heard me mention this, but a lot of times when I'm talking with people about major life decisions, should I do this or should I do that? One of the comments that I oftentimes make is that when we look at our lives, we learn a lot more about God looking through the rearview mirror than we do the windshield. And sometimes things happen in our lives, and sometimes good and bad. And at the time, we may not recognize all that's going on, but looking back, then we oftentimes see God working in ways that either first we didn't understand or we couldn't either have done ourselves. And so, central idea, God did some great things, and I just use the word downtime, meaning he's not going to start another church and doing other things. And our aim today is to urge each of us just to be faithful with every opportunity, because we don't know what God is actually doing or how he's working in our lives at any given moment. Acts chapter 20. Paul is in Macedonia and Greece. And I wonder, how many times did this happen? After the uproar ceased. And you just look at all these things that Paul endured, and you'll find several of these in 2 Corinthians 11. But after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. And there he spent 3 months. And this is, in essence, kind of where our lesson is going to kind of work from today. Oh, he's gone back to Greece and be thinking Corinth, one of these areas. And all that Dr. Luke says, he spent 3 months. A plot was made against him by the Jews as he was about to set sail for Syria. So he decided to return through Macedonia. Originally, he is going to try to get back to Palestine for Passover, and he's going to have to take a detour because of these plots. But as we're going to see, Pentecost, and just go ahead and let me do this, Pentecost is 50 days after Passover. So when we come to this discussion about the first day of the week, we know that the first gospel sermon and the preaching of the gospel in Acts chapter 2 is on a Sunday, because Passover is on a Sabbath, and if you do 50 days, 7 times 7 is 49, and you add 1, then the preaching of the sermon in Acts chapter 2 is on Sunday. It's on the first day of the week. But notice, and this is one of these little snapshots, look at these guys' names. Here's Sopater the Berean, the son of Phaeus, he accompanied him, and we have Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and then from Derbe we have Gaius and Timothy, and then of the Asians we have Tychicus and Trophimus. Wouldn't it have been a thrill to travel with Paul? And a part of what is going on, in addition to him oftentimes just reaching out and encouraging and helping, He is always, in a sense, and I always keep a baton in my office, Paul is always thinking about passing the baton of faith on to the next generation. And then in addition to this, they're going to be involved in taking a collection from Greece, Macedonia, to Jerusalem. A famine has been taking place. And so these young men are with him. Some people kind of laugh at this, but I also think they're also probably partial bodyguards. If you're traveling by ship and you're carrying actual money with you, it'd be nice to have some people there just for security purposes, but also the spiritual side. Just look at the serendipity, look at the benefits of these young men being able to travel with Paul. 20 and verse 5. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas, but we, and here's Dr. Luke involved in the story, we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. I'm sorry. As a preacher, you have to laugh. He prolonged his speech until midnight. I wonder if there are any complaints. And we'll talk about this process here in just a little bit. But he talked to them till midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting in the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked longer and longer. When Tim and Callie came with us to Sydney this year, we went to a wildlife park, and the koalas are nocturnal, so they're just sound asleep in the daylight. You know, here they're sitting there just, and under his breath, Tim said, that looks like some people I preached to on Sunday morning. I mean, okay, they're nocturnal, it's daytime, they're sound asleep, but this poor guy is sitting in the window. He falls asleep. He fell from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, he said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak. So just kind of let this settle in. Here's an all-night Bible study that takes place. And also, I'm sure in the back of his mind, Paul is getting more and more confident that these are going to be some of the last times he has to talk with these people. And on the other hand, for the people in this church to be able to have the Apostle Paul with them for any period of time is going to be a blessing. And anyway, they talk until daybreak and they depart. They took the youth away alive and were not little comforted. When you read through Acts, Dr. Luke uses this expression, little. There was no little disturbance, Acts 12:18. Acts 14:28, they came back on the first missionary journey to Antioch, and they remained no little time. Chapter 19, in Ephesus, there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. Demetrius, this brings no little business to the craftsman. So for whatever reason, one of Luke's idioms, his expression, when he wants to talk about something great and something big, he says, it was no little. And that was just a part of his expression. If you walk into an auditorium and the reading is coming from the Gospels and you hear immediately, straightway, you think, okay, that's Mark. If it's an older translation, Dr. Luke will say, well, a certain man went to a certain place. And there's always certain styles that an author uses. And just one of those things in the book of Acts, when Luke talks about something major has happened, he says, well, this was no little event that took place. So Dr. Luke has joined Paul again. We gather together to break bread. Most of you are familiar with this, but through the years, I've talked with several Seventh-day Adventists, and they're just such sincere and, in fact, very godly-minded people. But the typical expression that I hear when I talk with people who worship on this, and they call it the Sabbath day, they just say, there's no direct command in the New Testament to not worship on Saturday. And obviously, the Jews had done that for centuries. And I try to be really polite when they do this. I occasionally hear someone say, well, it was a pope who changed it from Saturday to Sunday. And 200 or 300 years later, one of the popes mentioned that. But that's not the reason why the early church worshiped on the first day of the week. And you just look at these examples. As we mentioned, Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, we know for sure that's on Sunday. And here in Acts 20 and 7, they have stayed for an entire week. And Dr. Luke just specifically says, okay, it's the first day of the week when they gather together to break bread. 1 Corinthians 16 and 2, and here again is this collection that Paul is taking up. And he simply says, on the first day of the week, each of you are to put something aside. And then even the book of Revelation, John will say, oh, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So it's very clear that both from the New Testament and from the early church, the only time that Christians worshiped would be on the first day of the week, and that's a part of the practice that we have. When you come across a biblical name with EU in it, the stem, the root word is good. Eunice, who we're going to hear in a little bit, at the root of the word Eunice is going to be good. In Philippians 4, her name is Euodia, EU. Well done, good and faithful servant, EU. And so I'm reading a writer, and he said, good luck or good fortune was unlucky and fell out the window. And so his name is Eutychus. And so anytime you have EU in a biblical name, then it has something to do with something that is good. And that was his comment. He said, good luck, good fortune was unlucky. And you will see examples and echoes of Elijah and Elisha, and sometimes they'll even lay on a dead person and pray for the miracle to take place. And let me say it this way. You have no idea what goes on in an auditorium during a sermon. Do you? Just all kinds of things happen. On Sunday night at Eastside, just preaching away. Hartman was the sheriff for East Oklahoma County, 6'4", huge hands. This guy's getting all excited right about back here on the back row. And Hartman just comes in and reaches up and picks him up by the shoulder and picks him up and goes out the back door and closes the door. And I'm thinking, okay, now where are we? You know, what's going on? And later I talked to our sheriff, and he said, well, every time we have a visitor, when I shake hands with them, I do a breathalyzer when I shake hands with them. And he said, when this guy came in, he was filled with a spirit, but he also told me he was Pentecostal. And so he was about to be filled with the Holy Spirit and start speaking in tongues. So I figured you didn't need to have that in your sermon, so I just quietly removed him from the auditorium for all of this takes place. And you're up front, you've seen all this going on, you're trying, okay, now where are we? Well, here's Paul, and anticipate. Preach will be in some of our translations. Luke spells it D-I-A-L-O-G-U-E. It's a back and forth. We're on the third story. No matter how interesting the topic is, I'm sorry, I don't want this to, anyway, when a guy falls out the window from the third story, that tends to stop the lesson. Who knows? Did he yell on the way down? You know, you hear this crunch, whatever happened. And, you know, so the whole Bible study stops. Paul goes down and then is going to heal the young man, bring back to life, or at least assures that he's there. And then where do we pick up from where we were before? So we go back up on the third story, and then the Bible study continues on from there. One of the people that I read this week, he said, after raising Lucky from the dead, Paul goes back to teaching upstairs. And so, like I said, when you come across any kind of biblical name with this EU, then he was fortunate that even though he fell out the window, Paul was there to make sure that he was able to live. I want to do something else just from the middle part of Acts. And there's a 2-volume set, I don't know if we call them encyclopedias, dictionaries, that I just use a lot. And they're entitled Lau and Nida. And Lau and Nida are involved in doing Bible translation, especially for tribes and people who don't have portions of Scripture. And one of our teachers worked for the Bible Society. And his job was to know every possible variant and meaning for every word in Philippians, Titus, and 1 Peter. And so sometimes to get to the place, they'd ride a canoe, they'd ride a donkey, they'd be way up, who knows, in these other places. And there'd be 3 people involved, and this would take basically a week. And they wanted to have one person who'd lived there 15 to 20 years. So he would know the native language and English, and then to have at least 1 or 2 local people. And then here he came as the Greek student. And they would work on a translation, and then this person would read it to the native, and he would tell him what he heard and what he discovered. And it would take nearly a week to translate Titus or Philippians or 1 Peter. All of the terms in the New Testament are divided by what they call semantic domain. And so the languages all have different terms. Under the term for communication in the New Testament, just take a wild guess. How many words are in our New Testament that have something to do with communication? Just take a wild guess. 489. There are 489 either different terms or variants for some type of communication that take place within the writing of the New Testament. So I wanted just to pause for a second and just say, in this middle part of Acts, what are the terms that Dr. Luke uses to teach us what was going on with the spread of the gospel? Because teaching and preaching, yes, can be done as we're doing today, but teaching and preaching also has a wide variety of other contexts. So when you look at, and this is, I didn't put Acts chapter 17, I should have. Acts chapter 17, verse 2, Paul went as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbaths, and notice, very quickly, Luke gives us 4 different things that are going to happen just in this one setting in the synagogue. 1, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining, proving, and proclaiming. Isn't that interesting? In one setting, in one place, then there are at least 4 different types of communication that are taking place while Paul is here in the synagogue. And here's the first one. And again, I spell Dialogue. And you stop and think. They oftentimes allow a person to give a reading from the Old Testament in a synagogue, and then if you have a word of encouragement or something to say. And so what Luke is going to tell us is that there's going to be this interaction and there's going to be this dialogue, questions and comments coming back and forth, and this would be a part of what took place. And it's to discuss, includes speak and preach, but it also can be argue, to argue a point, argue a position. And here's this interchange. And a part of the reason why I wanted to do this again is what takes place in this third story that we just read about. And then you stop and think, what kind of a of an interaction, and how interesting would it be to be able to have this interaction with Paul. I loved Raymond Kelsey. He always was thinking about something that he either hadn't thought about or was trying to decide, and he always kept a list of 10 things. But at different times, you would hear him say, when I get to heaven, I want to ask Paul, and here would come a comment. And like, for example, we're going to see in a little bit, during this downtime that we're looking at, Paul writes the book of Romans. And in the book of Romans, he says, I want you to send me to Spain. We don't have any comment, any explanation in the New Testament, so Raymond Kelsey would say, when I get there, I want to ask Paul, did you get to Spain? And so when you had class with him, there was always this kind of give and take and this interaction. He was such the gentleman. Occasionally somebody would say something that was just off the wall, totally out of bounds, and you're thinking, okay, what's he going to say? And Brother Kelsey would say, you know, I never thought of that before. And the reason was it was so far out in left field that no one else had thought about it either. And then he would quietly just go back to the subject matter, and the student left thinking complimented, I brought up something in class today Raymond Kelsey never thought of before. And he let him make the comment and then brought it right back to the subject and kept it going. And what is that? Dialogue. And so a big part of what's going on before Eutychus falls out of the window and then until sunrise isn't just Paul simply only given a lesson, but it's that exchange and that back and forth, and that's the first word that's there. The second word, to explain. Remember Jesus in Luke 24 opened their minds when he read the scriptures and explained to them the things that were happening. A third word is to prove something or to demonstrate. And I love to hear a lesson where a person just kind of very carefully lays something out and you look at it and a little bit you kind of go, oh, okay, so that's where that fits and that's where that takes place. The fourth word is the word simply to proclaim. And of all the terms, this is the most kind of preaching word. When I think of the prophets in the Old Testament, the prophets are called to speak forth, and they typically announce, thus saith the Lord, and it is a proclamation, and that's one of the words that was used. The fifth word that's there, they accuse Paul in Athens of being, and depending upon your translation, babbler is the one we hear in most of our translations. The literal word also means a scavenger or escape monger. This is not a compliment. Oh, what is this babbler talking about someone raising from the dead? Well, even in a context of preaching on Mars Hill, here is one of the communication words, and some of the Athenians, skeptically, who are listening to Paul, then are going to refer to him as a babbler. Then we'll find Paul is going to, in 18:5, is going to devote himself to preaching, meaning being occupied with the word. And then we have another word, to testify, which can be to charge or to warn, something very important to do at different times. And then when Paul has this vision in Acts chapter 18, the voice tells him, do not be afraid, do not be silent, and then here it comes, keep on speaking. I have many people in this city, and a totally different communication word is used for that one. So if you look at the next page, there's just a couple more. We'll do these and then move to something else. Paul is going to speak boldly for 3 months in Acts 19 and 8. And then again, we have the word discussion. There's dialogue again. But here's this word that comes up over and over and again, and we'll mention this toward the end. I always think of Barnabas when I hear this, but it's this word encourage, and again it has to do parakaleo, to put the arm around someone and to pull them close and to speak to them in a really sometimes tender but also urging way. And he will speak many words of encouragement. And then there's another word that just has to do with discuss. You'll see in Acts 20 and 11, after talking until daylight. And again, I just try to imagine being in the audience where we have the blessing of having Paul with us, and even if we're exhausted the next day, this discussion went on through the night, interrupted by Eutychus. He's okay, and then the discussion continues on until midnight. And this is something that's just a part of, again, a small glimpse, but in the middle part of the book of Acts, look at all the different settings, the types, the words, the example of communication. And a person writing about the church in the 1st and 2nd century, and this isn't a biblical word, but it just stuck in my mind, he just simply said, the early Christians went about gossiping the gospel. As they traveled, and as we're going to see, people like Aquila and Priscilla with their trade and other things. And as you go from the 1st century into the 2nd century, you can notice trade routes, you can notice where people travel, and churches are going to be established into the 2nd century, and people from the church and people who are Christians are going to go about gossiping the gospel. But something I want us to think about is that what happens after you start these churches? Because there's kind of different kind of processes. And there's a whole mentality in kind of going into an area where there's no church at all and starting a church there for the first time. My brother Kent and Nancy have taken Oklahoma Christian students typically for a month, and they'll go to one church for 2 weeks and then have a retreat with young people in the area and go to another church for 2 weeks. But we had some friends that we knew were going to go to a place called Coffs Harbour, which is halfway between Sydney and Brisbane. And the 2 years before they went, Kent took a group of OC students and said, here's the deal. In time, 2 or 3 families are going to move here to start a church. There is no church in this community. And for 2 weeks, I want us to just meet as many people as we can, to make contacts, to talk with people, if we can have a Bible study. But he said, most of you have grown up in a church that probably even had a building, probably had elders, probably had a preacher, and you've never been in a town where there is no Church of Christ at all, and one's about to be started. And I'd like for you to have the experience of 2 weeks of just thinking, what can we do to get this thing started, because there's no church already here. Can you imagine what a wonderful experience that would be for a college student? You know, to get to be with a missionary for 2 weeks and then be thinking about how would we do this, how would we start, how do we make contacts, and all these other things. Well, that's what Paul loved doing. However, it's kind of like having a baby. Once the baby gets here, you have a whole group of responsibilities that you didn't have before the baby came. And so I just did these off the top of my head. But notice, these are things that Paul is going to increasingly be involved with. He still will be taking the gospel to new areas, but more and more of his time is going to be spent maturing and working with the churches that have been started, because they're baby churches. They're brand new. I don't know if I'll mention this in the next section or not. Before we went to start, we started a church. If you take Oklahoma City and move everybody in Oklahoma inside the Oklahoma City limits and shut down all the freeways, that's what living in Sydney was like when we were there. But think Newcastle, the first town coming into Oklahoma City from the south, if you're coming in from Chickasha. We went to a place called Campbelltown, and naively we had said, wouldn't it be nice for us to have kind of some thoughtful and prolonged minutes around the Lord's Supper? You know, really take time to kind of focus on that and to do that. And so same type thing. We move in, my brother starts putting articles in the newspaper, we meet people on the soccer team, we meet people at school, and we start the church. Not too long later, and it changes over time, but this is burnt in my mind, we had 11 adults and 22 kids. And at 7 years of age, our son Luke was the oldest kid in the group. You imagine having church with 11 adults and 22 kids. You have no quiet moments around the Lord's Supper. Get right up here. If there's silence, the kids are going to take over, keep this thing going, get this going. And that was the process of starting from just a baby church and on and on. Robert and Christine Joshua had 2 girls. They'd never been to church before. The second Sunday, the person said, "Shall we stand and close our eyes for prayer?" Well, the little girls thought, everyone's gone to sleep, we can leave. And so they bolt out the door, and they're gone. So we stopped church services, and we're searching for these 5- and 7-year-old girls, and thankfully, I come around the corner, and they're nearly toward the edge of the lake, about to go around another corner, and we send someone in a car to get them. They've never been to church before. So if everyone closes their eyes, that's our clue to split. We're gonna be gone. And so as you start and build a church, there's more and more responsibility. So look at these. There's the planting, grassroots evangelism. Remember, I planted, Apollos watered. There's going to be a watering process for people to help to mature. And then at some point, there's leadership. Who's going to step forward? And this is a longer process. How do we resolve conflict and differences in the church? And then even a transition. What happens when the original workers leave and then the church is left on its own? And what we're going to see is that during this 3 months in Greece, Paul is involved in a lot of these different things, but as we're going to see, he also is going to take time to dictate and write Romans and 2 Corinthians. And here he is at seemingly kind of a quiet time in his ministry. He's not traveling, he's not starting new churches, but something very, very significant is going to take place. There are some guys that just love to do number one, and they're good at it, and I just tell them, sick them, just go get them. But if you start a new church, there needs to be someone to come in to be able to stabilize and to strengthen that church after it takes place. And these are all a part of the responsibilities that grow with Paul as these churches grow. I shouldn't enjoy this passage as much as I do, but look at this number 2 at the bottom. After the riot, Paul left Ephesus and headed toward Macedonia. When he was not able to find Titus to give him a report about the church, he said, "I left a wide open door, evangelistic door, because I didn't hear from Titus, and I left." It's really nice to see a guy as mature as Paul have something that bothers him so much that he doesn't do something that he loves to do. Can you imagine Paul? A wide open door for evangelism, but we haven't heard about the Corinthians. I haven't heard from Titus. And he leaves a preaching opportunity until he can hear about the church that's there. And like I said, during this time, Paul writes to the Corinthians, but he also writes a letter to Rome. So if you look at the back page, here again is one of these, we would like to know the rest of the story. Romans 15:23. I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and think, Acts 20. I have longed for many years to come to you. I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain and be helped on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while. And he goes on to talk about those things, and he says, I will leave for Spain by way of you. If you look at his earlier work, Antioch was home base. And they will go on the missionary journeys, and they'll come back to Antioch. And Antioch is the one who keeps sending them out. And I call it on the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And we won't have time to go into great detail, but here's one of the amazing things. When you read Romans 16, Paul has not been to Rome and mentions 30-plus people by name in the church in Rome. Aquila and Priscilla are back there, and he says, oh, they've risked their lives for me. Rufus, and if you read Mark, oh, the guy that carried the cross, he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, and you have to wonder, is that one of the same ones? And here's a list of 30 plus people in a church that Paul hasn't been to yet. But in my mind, if we're right in the middle of the Roman Empire, Paul would like for the Christians in Rome then now to support him, then send him on to Spain to preach and evangelize there. And we'll have to wait to see if he ever got there because we don't have any details. We won't look at all of these individually, but I just thought it'd be interesting. Here are just periods of time in Paul's life. You know, initially there's 3 years, and then he'll say, 14 years later, and you can read through that and see the different time periods that are there. So we're down to the very bottom, and we'll do these quickly. We've made this, but let's remind ourselves. You read the Acts 20, it doesn't look like a lot is going on. However, it's during this time that Paul writes 2 Corinthians and Romans. And as thoughtful, especially as Romans is, you can't do something like that while you're on the run. You'd really need some time to kind of think through that and the detailed arguments and the thoughtfulness and the richness of Romans comes from, and for some people would say, well, this may have been an insignificant time reading Acts. And then you find out later, yes, during this 3 months, here's some of the richest letters that we have from Paul that were written during this particular period of time. And Paul could not have written Romans after the Damascus Road. And that's a part of why I wanted to give you all these different years. God has been seasoning him. God has been maturing him, and both his interactions that are going to take place. And this is something very significant, and here's an entire lesson, but just in a word. You look, and whether it's Joseph, Moses, Paul, Jesus, God often uses times of isolation, times where people are by themselves to accomplish things. And I think he's had contact with Barnabas, the thrills and trials of church planting, the problems with that. And because of that, God has been preparing him to get to the point that he could write the book of Romans. And here's the last thing. And I mentioned this before, but I thought this is appropriate just to kind of close with today. The last time I got to listen to Howard Norton speak, other than when he was here, he made the comment to preachers, he said, I'm confident that most of us will not know the most significant thing we did for God in this life. And he said it may have just been a conversation, it may have been an incident, it may have been something that we really didn't either think about or know about, but because God is God, he may have produced a whole group of things from that that we may not ever be aware of. And that's really stuck with me. In this life, most of us will not know the most significant thing we do for God. And then here's what he said next. Therefore, be faithful with every opportunity that comes your way, and let God be God, and in his own time, work out things that you would not either have thought about or wouldn't understood, but in his own time, God may be working with you and through you to accomplish things that you never understood if you'll be faithful with every opportunity that God gives you.